Θεοφιλέστατε, κύριε Αναπληρωτή, είπατε αρμοστά, κύριε Πρόξενε της Ελλάδας, κύριε Πρόεδρε της Παγκόσμιας Ομοσπονδίας Αποδήμων Κυπρίων, κύριοι Πρόεδροι παραρτημάτων των κομμάτων και παροικιακών οργανώσεων, αγαπητοί συμφοιτητές, κυρίες και κύριοι, με μεγάλη χαρά σας καλωσορίζω για ακόμη μια φορά στο ωραίο αυτό οίκημα της ελληνικής κυπριακής αδελφότητας, στην 5η διάλεξη του 12ου χρόνου διαλέξεων του Ελεύθερου Πανεπιστημίου για την Ομογένεια του Λονδίνου, που οργανώνονται πάντα από την ελληνική κυπριακή αδελφότητα σε συνεργασία με το Πανεπιστήμιο Κύπρου. Θέμα μας σήμερα, αρκετά δύσκολο αγαπητοί συμφοιτητές, διότι μπαίνουμε στα δύσκολα, Monetary and Fiscal Policies and the Labour Market in the Eurozone. Εισηγητής, ο γνωστός σε όλους, και τον καλωσορίζω για πρώτη φορά εδώ στο οίκημα της αδελφότητας, ο καθηγητής Σερ Χριστόφορος Πissarides, που είναι Regius Professor στο London School of Economics και καθηγητής Ευρωπαϊκών Σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο Κύπρου. Κύριε καθηγητά, καλώς ορίσατε. Και νομπελίστας οπωσδήποτε. Με συγχωρείτε. Αυτά που γράφουν, αυτά λέω. Χορηγή επικοινωνίας, θα ήθελα να το δηλώσω, της εκδήλωσης οι εφημερίδες Ελευθερία και Παροικιακή, εδώ στην Παροικία, και ο Φιλελεύθερος στην Κύπρο. Ως επίσης ο ελληνικός ραδιοσταθμός Λονδίνου LGR, το Hellenic TV, το ραδιοφωνικό Ίδρυμα Κύπρου και το ΚΙΠΕ. Να σας πω, θα τα πω εγώ, να σας πω λίγα λόγια για τον εισηγητή στα αγγλικά, μια και η διάλεξη θα είναι στα αγγλικά. Sir Christoforos Pissarides is the Regius Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, Professor of European Studies at the University of Cyprus, and Chairman of the Council of National Economy of the Republic of Cyprus. He specializes in the economics of labor markets, macroeconomic policy, economic growth, and structural change. He was awarded the 2010 Nobel Prize, in economics, jointly with a couple of other gentlemen, for his work in the economics of markets with frictions. Prior to that, in 2005, he was the first economist outside the United States to win, again jointly with somebody else, the ISA Prize in Labor Economics. He has written extensively, which is?
It's a German prize.
Is it? Yeah. It's a German prize. So you jointly won it with Dale Mortensen, who is an American. Okay. He has written extensively in professional journals, magazines, and the press, and his book, Equilibrium Unemployment Theory, is an influential reference in the economics of unemployment that has been translated in many languages. He is frequently quoted in the press on issues concerning the Eurozone and the future of European integration. He is an elected Fellow of the Econometric Society, the British Academy, the Academy of Athens, the Academia Europaea, and several other learned societies, and he is a lifetime honorary member of the American Economic Association. In 2010, he served as the president of the European Economic Association. In the same year, he received the Grand Cross of the Republic of Cyprus, the highest honor of the Republic. He was knighted in 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, αγαπητοί συμφοιτητές, without further ado, please welcome Sir Christoforos Pissarides.
Κύριε Πρέσβης, χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ που βρίσκομαι εδώ για πρώτη φορά στο κέντρο της αδερφότητας. Έτσι, out in the sticks, όπως θα λέγαμε, γιατί εμείς μένουμε πιο κεντρικό Λονδίνο. Αλλά ο οδηγός μου, ο γραμματέας σας εδώ, μου έκανε και κάποια ξενάγηση στο Φίνσλι, ενώ ερχόμαστε. Που ήταν πολύ ευχάριστη και μου δίνει ιδιαίτερη χαρά που να σας μιλήσω. Η ομιλία θα είναι στα αγγλικά, γιατί έτσι είχα ρωτήσει και έτσι μου είχα πει, θα μπορούσα να μιλήσω και στα ελληνικά, αφού είστε και Κύπριο εδώ, οι περισσότεροι τουλάχιστον αισθάνομαι πιο άνετα να μιλήσω ελληνικά όταν βρίσκομαι με συμπατριώτες. Αν πετάξω κανένα μαργαριτάρι, μπορεί να θεωρηθεί κανονική ομιλία, ας πούμε, σε τέτοιο περιβάλλον. Χαίρομαι επίσης να πω αυτόν το the usual disclaimer, όπως λένε στα ελληνικά, applies. Χαίρομαι που είναι και κυπριακές εφημερίδες χορηγοί και θα ήθελα να πω πριν ξεκινήσω πως κανένας δεν μου είπε να έρθω να πω αυτό που θα πω, κανένας δεν τα λέω με καμιά σκοπιμότητα, αν άλλοι σαν οικονομολόγος που σκέφτηκα να τα πω, διότι τελευταία όποτε κάνω δηλώσεις στο κυπριακό τύπο, πάντα βλέπω, ακόμα αυτόν και χτες έλεγε, γιατί μίλησε ο Πissarides, ποιος του είπε να τα πει, ποιον προσπάθησε να προστατεύσει, γιατί δεν έχω ιδέα τι λέει ο ένας και τι λέει ο άλλος. Οπότε το λέω και επίσημα. Ο πρώτος Αναστασιάδης ούτε καν το ξέρει πως βρίσκομαι εδώ. Παρά αυτά που λέγονται, πώς μου λέει τι να πω κάθε φορά. Λοιπόν, να αλλάξουμε στα αγγλικά. Το θέμα μου, όπως θα έχετε καταλάβει, είναι για νομισματική και δημοσιονομική πολιτική στην Ευρωζώνη. Είναι ένα θέμα το οποίο μιλώ εδώ και 2 χρόνια πάνω σε αυτό το θέμα, γιατί πιστεύω πως έχουν γίνει πολλά λάθη στην Ευρωζώνη και συνεχίζουν να γίνονται. Πριν το γυρίσω στις διαφάνειες, ας πω, επειδή είναι ομιλία του Ανοιχτού Πανεπιστημίου, την έκανα με μορφή πανεπιστημιακή, αλλά αν δεν καταλάβετε ορισμένα πράγματα, μη σας ανησυχεί. Περιμένετε και θα καταλάβετε το επόμενο. Αν δεν καταλάβετε ένα slide, θα καταλάβετε το επόμενο. Μην ανησυχείτε. Ή μου κάνετε ερωτήσεις στο τέλος. Δεν χάθηκε ο κόσμος, ας πούμε. Δεν είναι αστυνομική ιστορία που πρέπει να καταλαβαίνεις κάθε βήμα για να τα βγάλεις στο τέλος. Λοιπόν, okay. Let's then switch. What I want to talk about is the monetary and fiscal policies that have been followed in the Eurozone, what I think should be followed, and why I think the policies that have been followed have been wrong. And we could start with a brief diagnosis of what's been happening, and we have to admit that things are not quite right in the Eurozone. It's not delivering what it promised. I mean, most of you were probably around in the 1990s when we talked about forming a single currency. We said that there was going to be prosperity, there was going to be more growth, more trade, fuller employment. We got nothing of all that. Now, the question is that because of faults in the structure of labor markets? This is what you hear most frequently from German policymakers. I heard it, they said that to me in person. You know, the president of the Bundesbank, for example, when I gave something along these lines in his bank, he said to me, no, the fault is with labor markets, and he just talked about labor markets. You hear Schäuble, the German finance minister, you hear the Dutch, the Finns, they all talk that the fault lies with the structure of the labor markets. Is that the case? Well, I'm going to argue that that's not the case. It's not labor markets that are at fault. Now, is the fault with the monetary and fiscal policies that were followed after the recession of 2008? And I'm going to argue that the answer is yes. That's where the problem lies. Now, to get into the argument, because I want to justify what I'm saying rather than make it as a claim, I want to say a few things about how we got into the crisis, and you're going to see that what I'm saying is, I hope I'm going to persuade you with what I'm saying is the right thing, although given the audience I might be pushing through open doors, but anyway, I'm going to push in any case. Now, the crisis that we're going through now is something that started after the Great Recession of 2008, and it started as a debt crisis. It's a sovereign debt crisis. And what happened was that the policies that were followed to reduce debt, which was important to reduce the debt, but the policies that were followed exposed some weaknesses in European labor markets. And for this reason, because we saw the weaknesses that were exposed, many people said, therefore the fault lies with the labor markets. This is a little bit like when you have a sick patient and the illness might be somewhere in the body, and then it shows up as a cough, and you say, that's what's wrong with this person. You know, he's got a cold and they cough, and that's why. You know, you look at the symptom rather than the cause. And I'm going to argue that the cause is that it's a crisis of managing a common currency when we shouldn't have a common currency. In other words, we formed a common currency in a group of 18 countries now, when the criteria for having a common currency, what's known in economic theory as optimal currency area, are not satisfied. It wasn't very clear in 1999 that they were not satisfied. We were close to satisfying them, possibly with the exception of Greece, as I'm going to say. But now we know that they were not justified. So they were not satisfied. You might say I'm talking a little bit with hindsight, and of course I am. You know, scientists should observe what's happening and then formulate opinions. But I should also say that at least two countries that I was involved in their study teams on the question of whether they should join the single currency or not. You know, I was on the Treasury team of Great Britain under Gordon Brown when he was considering criteria for entry, and I was also in the equivalent committee in Sweden under an economist called Lars Calmfors, where we examined the criteria for entry, and both those teams decided that Britain and Sweden didn't see any benefits from joining the single currency because they believed that the criteria were not satisfied, and they didn't join. I didn't entirely agree in everything they said back then, but at least there were warnings at that time that the criteria failed. Now, if the criteria fail, what policies do you follow? Well, it's very difficult to find the right policy, but I do believe that what we've chosen is definitely the wrong policy, and there is room for improvement. Okay, now what about labor markets? Well, there's no doubt that European labor markets have become inflexible. And it's not only the southern labor markets that become inflexible, it's all European markets became inflexible around the late 70s. And some countries reformed. You know, the UK reformed in the 1980s and 90s. Netherlands reformed in the early 1990s. Germany had a famous reform under Gerhard Schröder in 2002-2005. But in Southern Europe, we didn't reform. And reforms are essential because if we follow the reforms that countries like UK, Netherlands, and Germany have followed, we're going to raise the competitiveness of our countries. We'll be able to compete more successfully with the Americans and the Japanese and the Chinese, and we're going to get wealthier. And this is what we're seeing in these countries. The UK has had the best growth rate in Europe. It's overtaken Italy. You know, if you want to know the difference, in fact, what difference these reforms make, in fact, just compare Britain and Italy. In 1989, they were at the same level of prosperity. In fact, Italy overtook the United Kingdom for 1 year in 1989, when the European Commission found a way of including unreported economic activity. It was the famous sorpasso. Now the UK is about 15% wealthier than Italy. And the difference is simply that the UK reformed in the early 90s. I should say that the reforms were started in a very, we should say, acrimonious way by Thatcher, but it's really Tony Blair, in my view, who made the difference in bringing in unions to agree to implement the reforms. Italy didn't reform, and Italy stagnated. It became the Japan of Europe, and it's only Renzi now who is doing useful work. And long may he remain in power, because they do need it. But you can see the difference, though. And I'm saying that because we do need those reforms. But in my view, to come back to my main theme, the debt management policies that we followed and the inflexible labor markets that we have in Southern Europe got mixed up, and we had bad outcomes for both. Bad outcomes in the labor market and bad outcomes in debt. In fact, we got the worst of both worlds by doing what we've been doing so far. Okay, now what follows next is it's a very abbreviated form of something that I spend a lot more time when I address university audiences, which to persuade them that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. And I'm going to tell you, I mean, it's quite easy to explain, in fact, in non-technical language, why the countries of the Eurozone shouldn't have a common currency, the way we're seeing it now. And many economists work in that. In fact, what it says here is something that was developed by an economist, a Canadian economist called Robert Mundell, and he won a Nobel Prize for this work, for the optimal currency area work. He's one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished, international economists in the world. And what he argued is that if countries are going to form an optimal currency area, if they're going to adopt the same currency, they should have similar economic structures. There should be free mobility of labor and capital. And if possible, what's desirable is that there should be fiscal transfers between them. In fact, in effect, they should pass money to each other as needed. Those were his main criteria. Now, why he said that is that if countries are, the first one, let me explain to you very briefly why. The first one, that countries should be similar, if they're going to have the same currency, it makes sense that they should be similar countries. You know, if they are too dissimilar, they need to have different exchange rates. That's the argument behind the first one. The second one is that if say you have two countries, and one of them gets something bad happens to one of them, and it gets high unemployment, and the other one doesn't suffer from that, then if they cannot adjust their exchange rates, then another way of correcting this imbalance is for the unemployed from one country to leave and go and work in the other country. So you balance them out. And that's what the freedom of movement of labor does. And the same with the capital stock. If one country has lots of investment and the other doesn't have an investment, they cannot adjust their rates of exchange. So you move capital from one to the other. The rich country invests in the poor country. That's the idea behind it. Now, does the Eurozone satisfy these criteria? Well, mobility of labor and capital are free in the Eurozone, but in fact, they don't happen. They are free, but Europeans don't move. So if there is high unemployment in one country, the unemployed don't move to the other country. And if they do, they move in tiny numbers. That doesn't correct imbalances. Now, what about investment? Do the poorer countries attract a lot of investment from the rich countries? Well, in good times they do, in bad times they don't. And I think I have some more explanation here. Okay, labor mobility. Migration flows are very small in Europe. Although they are free, we don't move. And that's basically because we are well off and we prefer living in the country of our birth. Just look at you here. Yeah. That's the majority. That's the kind of, not for everyone. Receiving countries don't like the migration very much. We hear David Cameron talking about it all the time. And what's worse is that when we do see migration, we don't see the unemployed and the unskilled moving. we see professional groups moving. You know, the people living in Greece now, for example, the workers living in Greece are mainly professionals. And that's not what the theory requires, because those are needed in the country to revive the country. What the theory says is that those who are unemployed should move, but those don't move because they're not entitled to social transfers when they change country. It's expensive to move. So migration fails as a corrective mechanism. What about capital mobility? Capital mobility fails as well. I think the biggest failure of countries like Greece today is to attract investment, whereas the theory says that countries like Greece should be attracting most of the investment in Europe. But in fact, investors don't go there because they're scared about the uncertainty. Germany attracts a lot more foreign investment than the poorer countries do, because you know that if you invest in Germany, you have the support of big industry, you have structures like property rights and so on that help you. If you're a foreigner, you feel much more secure to go and invest in a country like Germany, a rich country, than a poor country. That's a very big puzzle. Another Nobel Prize winner economist, in fact, asked the famous question, why does capital move from the poor to the rich? You know, it's an inevitable fact of life. So that doesn't work either. And the only investment that is attracted in the poorer countries are by institutions like the European Investment Bank, which is very good. It's an excellent bank, but it's too little. It's not enough to restore recovery in the country. I mean, I wish there were more, but they don't have money to invest more. Now, what about fiscal transfers? Failing what I just said, another way of doing it is by passing money from each other. You know, the rich give money to the poor. Well, in fact, in the Eurozone, you are not allowed to give money to the poorer countries by the Maastricht criteria. And fiscal transfers are not allowed in general in the Eurozone. Like Germany, for example, the German treasury is not allowed to buy Greek bonds and finance the Greek deficit, unless, of course, there is a decision to change the treaty. But by the treaty they signed, they're not allowed to do it. And the Maastricht criteria are there to ensure that they don't happen. Of course, you know, the European Stability Mechanism, which was put in place 500 billion euros after a lot of effort, is an exception to that rule. Because they are not allowed to do it bilaterally, they formed up the fund to do it centrally. It helps, and that's why not all banks are bankrupt in the Eurozone. But it's not something that can correct the imbalances completely. It can correct them to the extent that they have been corrected in Greece, for example. You know, like it keeps the country going, but only on the verge of existence or non-existence. Now, quantitative easing by the European Central Bank, what they just started, is a great idea, I think. It should have happened 2 years ago, but better late than never. It is an indirect form of a fiscal transfer because the European Central Bank can buy sovereign bonds of national governments. That's a good policy. I don't have any criticism to make there other than timing. We can wait and see what it does. It hasn't started yet. It's starting on the 1st of March. As examples of what I mean, you know, if you look, you know, which have been the successful monetary union examples from recent history, well, I put two here. The United States has been a very successful country in bringing about monetary union because, you know, remember that in 1860 they had a civil war, they had their own currencies, then later they expanded into a wild country in the West. They introduced the dollar as a single currency for the whole country. The states were not in a different state of development. You know, Massachusetts, for example, was much more developed than California at the time. How did the Americans succeed to make the dollar work? Well, with huge fiscal transfers. All the infrastructure in California was constructed with East Coast money. All the canals that brought water to the San Jose Valley and other places that provided the first agrarian revolution there. It was financed with East Coast money. That's a huge fiscal transfer. What about another famous example of where monetary union has succeeded is Germany. In 1990, East Germany was very different from West Germany, and they decided to form a monetary union with the same mark, the Ostmark and the Deutsche Mark, were join into a single currency at one-to-one exchange rate. How did it succeed? Huge transfers of West German money to the East. There was also a lot of migration, so both mechanisms work, migration and fiscal transfers. The point is that in both cases where monetary union worked, we had huge fiscal transfers, which we are not seeing now in the Eurozone. But in both cases, we had political union, which is something else that there is strong opposition in the Eurozone. So, if those mechanisms don't work, and if our economies are not very similar, how do they make them work? All right, next, I have some slides that show why the economies are not very similar, and I think it's down to the, in this case, where we're going through now, it's down to the size of the construction sector. In 2000, or in 1999, the economies were more or less the same. Greece was the only country that was not quite similar to the others. It had more agriculture, it had more trade with the Balkans and the East. It was more different from the others, but not too different. It could have worked. What happened since then, though, was and what's giving us the origins of the debt crisis was the expansion of the construction sector and the housing booms that we had in those countries. And the countries that especially expanded their construction sectors are Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Cyprus, Greece to a lesser extent, but it built up debt for other reasons, which we don't need to go into now. But essentially, this is where you see the big differences between the countries of the Eurozone. What the countries that have the problems are on the right, Ireland, Spain, Estonia, Latvia, I'll say a few things later, but the ones with red, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus, have construction sectors are about 12% of their employment. But then if you go to the other end, Netherlands, Slovakia, Sweden, Germany, France, they have construction sectors of about 6%. It's only half the size. Now, if you have a construction sector that is twice as big in one country than in another, and then you get hit by an international shock that destroys the construction sector, essentially, then obviously the countries that have the big sectors require a lot more money to be rescued than the other countries. And that's where the big differences have come about in the Eurozone countries. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the countries that had the big construction sectors needed to attract more money. They needed to become competitive again. Now, let me say, okay, this is again, I'm saying why not the Baltic states. The Baltic states had large construction sectors, but they also had very large growth rates. And when you have a very large growth rate, you can absorb a shock like that. There are countries, they were still going through transition. They were still rebuilding after the collapse of their Soviet system of government. Okay, so if you look at the countries with the big construction sectors, here, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus, and Italy to some extent, how would the labor market respond when you get hit by that shock? Because remember what I said in the beginning, is that we got a big debt shock, which is essentially due to construction, and that exposed weaknesses in labor markets, and therefore policymakers, some policymakers interpreted that as a weakness in the labor market rather than in the way that we dealt with the debt. Well, the way that you would respond is the following, is summarized here. If you have flexible exchange rates and you get hit by a shock like that, then the countries that had the big construction sectors would have had a big devaluation. Their exchange rates would have depreciated, their currencies would have depreciated. That would have made demand for all their other goods more competitive. There would be an increase in the demand for other goods, and that would take the place of the collapse in construction. If you like, in simple terms, the workers who lost their jobs in the construction sector would have gone to work in industries that exported, And because their currency would have become more competitive, they would be able to sell the products they were selling. That's the correction mechanism that you have. But here we don't have that correction mechanism. The fact that Greece, Spain, and Portugal collapsed didn't depreciate the euro enough. By a little maybe, but not enough to make their goods more competitive. So what do you do if you have that, all those construction workers there, they cannot find a job anywhere else in their country? Okay, one solution is for them to leave, out migration, but they didn't. Europeans don't move. Another solution is to be given money, pump money into those countries to invest in industry, and investing will create jobs. That didn't happen. They were given some money, especially in the banks, so as not to have a bigger collapse, but not enough to create the new jobs needed. If you don't have these, then what happens in the country? Well, what happens is what's known as internal depreciation, which I'm told is a term that features regularly in the Greek press, but not in the Cypriot press, from what I know. I can't remember the Greek term, actually, of internal depreciation, but it's... depreciation, which is the like devaluation. But essentially what it means in simple terms is wage reductions. Cut wages. Now what's the logic behind that? The logic behind it is that you cut wages, you make industry more competitive because labor is cheaper, and therefore you are still able to sell your goods at lower prices. You get deflation, in other words. So instead of having the depreciation of the currency, which would reduce costs throughout the production line, workers bear the cost of the recession, and their wages fall by as much as the currency would have fallen, and that makes your goods as competitive as they would be under the external depreciation. That's the logic behind it. Now, did the internal depreciation happen? Well, in order for internal depreciation to happen, you need a rise in unemployment. Otherwise, unions will never accept wage cuts. If there is full employment, why would the union or any worker accept a wage cut? So a parallel move with internal depreciation is that there should be a rise in unemployment, and that's what happened. I mean, look at the rise in unemployment. The same countries that I had on the right here, as being the countries that needed the depreciation, got the very big rise in unemployment. And did internal depreciation happen? Again, the answer is yes. And anyway, those countries are the ones that had the bigger recession because the increase in unemployment added on to the negative shock, so it was like cumulative. And then did the internal depreciation come? The answer is yes, and there is no better example of internal depreciation than Greece. Greece, we lost 14% of real average earnings. It's unprecedented in peacetime. Even in wartime, actually, it might be unprecedented, but in peacetime, it's unprecedented. And therefore, we have almost a textbook experiment, which I'm sure is going to be in economics textbooks for many years to come. If you tie the currency down through a monetary union and you replace that by internal depreciation, what happens to a country? So far, our textbook said exactly the same thing will happen. I heard very, very distinguished economists saying that in the late 90s when we were discussing the single currency. They were saying, why do you discuss it so much anyway? If you don't have the external depreciation, you're going to have internal depreciation and the outcome will be the same. That's the standard textbook view. We didn't have that in practice before. We never experienced something like that. For the first time, we're experiencing it in Greece. And in fact, the European Economic Association invited me to go to their annual meeting in August to talk about how economics textbooks should be rewritten in light of the experience of Greece. So it's going to become a famous example now in textbooks of economics. Your children and grandchildren will have to read about it one day. I guess mine too, but anyway. And you can see here what happened. These are the evolution of earnings in the problem countries relative to Germany, and you can see that after 2009, 2010, it all bends down, but no line bends down by as much as the black one, which is Greece. And you can see the figures here. If we say that real earnings in 2009 had an index of 100, in 2012 in Ireland was 97, Italy 98, Spain 97, Portugal 90, Greece 82, and in relation to Germany, they would be even below. In Greece, it was 80% in relation to Germany. So in 2 years, Greek workers lost 20% in wages relative to their German counterparts. Whereas the other biggest fall is in Italy, in fact, in Spain, which lost, Portugal, yeah, which lost 12%. Again, it's the countries that had the biggest rises in unemployment. All right, so this is the key question for an economist. You know, if I block this and ask an economist who hasn't been reading the press or following data in the last 3 years, you know, what do you think happened? He would have said to me, oh, you know, Greece should be on recovery now. But in fact, it's not. It's going deeper there. And this is the biggest failure of the combined programs of debt reduction, economic restructuring. This is the key, I think. That's why I think the programs have failed. Because the massive fiscal retrenchment, or depreciation, you know, in other words, the austerity, the famous austerity that's been followed, is being reinforced by the real wage reductions. And the real wage reductions reduced demand. So we had a double shock, a double negative shock, the fiscal austerity and the fall in demand that comes from a cut in earnings. And we have what's known as a Keynesian negative multiplier. The idea of the internal depreciation is that, I mean, everyone would argue that, okay, you know, fiscal austerity would have a negative multiplier, the economy would come down, but they would claim that the internal depreciation would offset that and raise it, but in fact it reinforced it. It moved exactly in the opposite direction. And why didn't they work? Well, these are standard Keynesian reasons. It's astonishing how when you, if you go back to read Keynes's famous book in 1936, when he was describing what happened in the Great Depression, because countries did follow the same policy in the Great Depression. In the United States, they followed this. Before the New Deal of, who brought the New Deal? Roosevelt, yeah. Before Roosevelt's New Deal, they were following policies that are very similar to what's being followed now in the Eurozone. And Keynes wrote his famous book immediately after that and said, you know, you should follow exactly the opposite, not what was followed before. Under Hoover, I think, was before Roosevelt, yeah. But in fact, it's been completely ignored. And we're following the same policy again. And what happens is it's a vicious circle in that you get high debt, you have the fiscal austerity, it reinforces the debt, you have wage reductions, they reinforce the fall in demand, and the debt becomes bigger. Troika comes in, says you've been unsuccessful in cutting your debt, therefore cut more. And you get a vicious circle with deflation that goes down and down. And even everyone agrees that deflation is not a good thing. They tolerate it because they say, you know, this is what we have to tolerate to recover. But, as I will say again in a minute, that is not bringing recovery. Now, is that because of the labor? Is it because of the labor markets that we are suffering these problems? The answer is clearly no. Ireland has one of the most flexible labor markets in Europe. Its aggregates, in fact, and how it responded to these two shocks, the fiscal austerity and the internal depreciation, has been very similar to Spain, which has one of the least flexible labor markets in the Eurozone. The European labor markets don't work well, because, especially of the South, because they are not flexible enough. We need the reforms. But that's not the reason that we have the problems. And this is the best example, again, compared to countries with completely different labor markets, but with similar fiscal policies. The yellow line is Spain, the red is Ireland. You can see that as far as GDP, which is standard of living, goes, Ireland even suffered more than Spain, but eventually more or less the same. They came down from 100 to about 90 or 87 and 90. But even more telling is what's been happening in their labor market. They're almost indistinguishable how they reacted in the labor market. If employment in 2007 was 100, they fell together in Spain and Ireland. And Ireland recovered faster because it applied, because of other help that they got, foreign investments from Irish Americans and Britain directly, of course. So fiscal transfers helped Ireland a lot. But if you look at their employment levels, they're the same. They both came down from 100 to 85 by 2012. How could you say that the problem in Spain is its inflexible labor market? It isn't. Ireland has a very flexible labor market. Now, the Keynesian lesson that, as if we needed a lesson because it's always been in the books, but anyway, there it is, that the debt explosion triggered deflationary fiscal policies. The debt explosion took place of recession, and the answer is that you don't fight recession with more deflation. The optimal policy response is to find expansionary policies elsewhere to offset the deflationary shock from construction and debt, not to impose more deflation, because that would make things worse. Okay, where do we find that alternative policy? Well, monetary policy should be the first one to react, because monetary policy is the one that decisions are made very quickly. They don't have to go through national parliaments. And the ECB, it really does need to create more inflation. The more inflation will depreciate the euro further. It's not low enough now. It's maybe too low compared with what Germany wants, but not with what the majority of the Eurozone wants, or at least should have in their economy, not wants for political reasons. The depreciating euro will reduce the burden of the debt, and it should try and inflate the economy. This is precisely what the Bank of England did when the coalition government in 2010 embarked on fiscal austerity to reduce the debt. That's what George Osborne believed. The Bank of England followed the correct policies. It inflated the economy. Inflation jumped up to something like 3-4%. Now it's way down, but now it's 4 years later and the economy recovered by then. The United States did it even faster, and they recovered after 2 years. And the Americans, in fact, are criticizing the British for being too slow in reacting, but they don't even bother anymore to discuss the ECB. They just say, kick the bucket down the road and hope for the best. That's how I heard American economists describe ECB policy. What is the ECB doing? It's failed to act for a very long time. Just before it acted, in this January, its policy, it was close to being a good policy for Germany. It wasn't even the right policy for Germany, in fact. But it was close to being the right policy for Germany. But it was badly off the mark, really the wrong policy for the European South. With the QE program, it's a good policy for the European South. It's not a bad policy for Germany, despite what German policymakers are saying. Not saying, but implying when you see them. And you can see this. You can see here why in December 2014 it was the wrong policy. The ECB, in theory, doesn't care about unemployment, shouldn't care about unemployment. What the ECB should care about, only one thing, inflation, and it wants inflation to be as close to 2% as it can get it, but not hit the 2%. That's a stated policy. Now, in Germany, inflation was 0.8%. In the southern countries, negative 0.2%, and in the Eurozone as a whole, 0.4%. If it acted as a bank for the Eurozone as a whole, it should have reacted to this 0.4%, which means it should have done QE long time ago. If it was following German data, it should be reacting to the 0.8%, which again requires expansion because it's a long way below 2%. But if it reacted to the southern data, it should have really expanded. What it's doing now is not clear. What it's doing now, I think, with the 60 billion a month, it is close to being good for the Eurozone, in fact. So it's only the timing that is a problem. Otherwise, what they've done so far is okay. Actually, this is in the wrong place. Here, my view, I mean, it's obviously not one that the ECB subscribes to, is that instead of erring on the negative side, it should be erring on the positive side when unemployment is high. It's the policy that's essentially been followed by the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. If your target of inflation is 2%, but unemployment is very high, then tolerate 3% until unemployment is corrected. Don't say, okay, I'm going to put up with 1% or 0% and hope that eventually things will work out, because you are not helping the economy. Even if you don't follow that policy, though, at least aim for the 2%. Don't keep it below 1. So anyway, the recent measures are good. The US Federal Reserve started this program 3 years ago, in fact, not 2, and we should have done the same, but we didn't. And what the European Central Bank's the way it's been justifying its inaction was that it would, that by 2016-17 we would be on target anyway. But the obvious question is, why do you want to wait that long if you can do it faster? Now, what about debt? Well, debt burdens now are tolerable, but they will not be when we come out of recession and interest rates start rising. I mean, the situation is just unsustainable. Something needs to be done. We have to find ways of reducing the debt burden. The ECB alone cannot do it, although the QE that is following will help, but it will not be enough. We need to do something more. And the answer is that we need more investment to break the Keynesian impasse that we're in, and we need to find ways of reducing the debt. Now, if we look at, because I put fiscal policy on the title, if you look at fiscal policy as to what we should be doing, the obvious answer is that we should suspend fiscal austerity until the economy recovers, because it's not going to recover with the fiscal austerity. It just makes the recession worse. We are fighting recession with recessionary policies. I mean, it's crazy. What about debt? Okay, that's fiscal policy, what we should be doing on the budget. What about debt? Well, we should restructure I mean, it's absolutely essential that we should restructure because we cannot pay for all the debt now. But whichever way we do it, repaying the debt in recession, again, is a bad idea. You don't pay off your loans when you don't have money. You pay off your loans when you do have money, if you can get away with it. And making payments conditional on GDP performance is the obvious way of doing it, as we explained in a letter to the Financial Times with some colleagues. And there is a follow-up today, by the way, if you want to read more about it after the lecture. Where the proposal we made was that no debt repayment should be made until GDP growth is 3%. I was quite content to stop there, but my colleagues added, and also when 50% of the losses have been recovered, and then you start paying. This is like saying, it's a little bit like the way we pay taxes. Like the government raises taxes to finance its programs. It doesn't tax you when your income is low. It taxes you when your income is high. Because when your income is low, you need it for other reasons. And that's exactly what we're saying here. If your income is so low and you need so desperately to invest, don't pay big chunks of your money now just to pay off the debt. Wait, use it for investment now and pay later. I'm saying they should allow it. Now, what about labor markets? Well, labor markets are not to blame now for what's happening, but we shouldn't forget that we do need to reform our labor markets if the Eurozone is going to work eventually. We don't have flexible labor markets. There have been some structural reforms that have been in the right direction. The country that's done most of the southern countries is Spain, which reformed in 2010, 2011. We're beginning to see some positive impact there. Greece, in fact, has reformed quite a lot on the OECD criteria at least, but they haven't been implemented as far as they should, and the austerity is partly to blame. And I believe that Italy is reforming very successfully now under Renzi. But we're not going to see any positive impact for another 2 or 3 years from those reforms. I had a, oh, there it is, yeah. I had a very interesting session with the leader of the Social Democrats in Germany, who is deputy to Merkel, I think now. He's in the government, certainly, because it's a coalition government. And he claimed that the 2002 to 2005 reforms, this was at the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos, he claimed that the reforms in Germany, 2002-2005, were effective because they had big budget deficits to support the reforms and invest at the same time. And that's when Germany broke the Maastricht criteria. It was the first country to break the Maastricht criteria in the Eurozone. But he said there was a very good reason why we broke the Maastricht criteria, he said. It made our structural reforms work. And we knew that if the structural reforms worked, then a few years later we could have surpluses to repay the debt that we raised during the reforms, which I thought was an excellent idea. So I was with a colleague there, and we actually asked him, so why don't you let Greece do the same? But he just smiled and started talking to someone else. but that's essentially what we're saying. You know, do as the Germans. So that's it then. With fixed exchange rates and single currency, we do need closer political cooperation, which means, you know, postpone debt repayments, don't insist on the austerity, give fiscal transfers are examples of closer political cooperation. Where we had success as the United States and East and West Germany, we had full political union. Market mechanisms break down if we don't have those in a monetary union, as we're seeing now. And we need the political will to help each other, otherwise we shouldn't get into partnerships like the Eurozone. We seem to have got into the Eurozone and formed a partnership and then not willing to help each other. So are we going to see more political will to help each other? I'm afraid I've become very disillusioned with, especially with German policy responses from Mr. Schäuble and Mrs. Merkel. Even Merkel is beginning to look like a moderate when compared with Schäuble nowadays. He's a very easily excitable man, by the way, Schäuble. I mean, he was pressed a lot at the World Economic Forum in a meeting I was, and he really exploded. And he said, "I know what's best for me," he said, you know, and hit his hand on the table. "I know what's best for Germany," he said, you know, like that. But if we don't do it, I think the future of the Eurozone and the European Union as a whole is very bleak. In fact, some observers believe that it will just not survive for the next decade. Who said that recently? Very good economists, in fact, very good international economists said that if we carry on the way we're doing now, it's not only Greece that might be forced to leave, but the whole of the Eurozone will break up, which I'm beginning to think that they do have a serious point. All right, thank you very much for listening.